He was 8 years old. He was wearing a shirt that was too big for him and shoes that had been polished until they shone, and he was standing in the aisle of St. Matthias Episcopal Church in front of 212 guests and a man in a tuxedo who was about to make the worst decision of his life. The boy's name was Calvin. His voice did not shake. "Sir," he said loud enough for the front rows to hear, and then as the room went quiet, loud enough for everyone. "Sir, your fiancée is lying." The bride turned. Her bouquet trembled. The groom, a man named Thomas Beaumont, 41 years old, who had spent 14 months believing everything about the woman beside him, looked from the boy to the woman he was about to marry, and something moved across his face. Not anger, not yet. Something more like the look of a man watching a building he has spent a long time constructing develop a crack and not yet knowing how deep it runs. The officiant stood with his book open and his mouth closed. 212 people did not breathe, and a boy in an oversized shirt who had no reason to be in this church except the one reason that mattered most, waited for someone to ask him what he knew. 3 years earlier, this is where it starts. Calvin Reese grew up in the Piedmont Homes housing development in Savannah, Georgia, where the street lights worked intermittently and the corner store stayed open until midnight because that was when people came, and where the schools were the kind that received children and tried hard and were chronically under-resourced in the specific structural way that made trying hard feel like swimming in a current that ran the other direction. His mother, Yolanda, was 26 years old when Calvin was born and had been working 2 jobs more or less continuously since he was old enough to go to a cousin's after school. His father had been gone since Calvin was 2. Not a mystery. Calvin knew where he was, knew his name, knew that some people chose not to, and that this was a thing you could hold without letting it define your ceiling. Yolanda was not a woman of many resources, but she was a woman of fierce and particular clarity about what mattered. She read to Calvin every night until he could read himself, and after that she made sure there were books even when there wasn't much else. She told him the truth about things, about money, about people, about why certain doors required certain keys, in the direct language of a mother who had decided that her son would understand the world rather than be surprised by it. She told him, "Watch people, not what they say, what they do when they think nobody's looking." Calvin watched. He was that kind of child, the quiet, observant kind that adults sometimes failed to account for, precisely because they were so quiet. He was 5 when Yolanda started cleaning houses. It was the work that fit her schedule. She could take Calvin with her in the summers and school holidays, could arrange the hours around his drop-off and pickup, could work independently without the surveillance of a supervisor who might not understand why she needed to leave at 3:15 sometimes. She built a client list over 3 years, 6 houses, steady, the kind of clients who paid on time and left her to her work and appreciated that she was thorough. One of those clients was a woman named Vivienne Marsh. Vivienne Marsh was 36 years old, lived alone in a 4-bedroom colonial in the Ardsley Park neighborhood, drove a car that cost more than Yolanda made in a year, and had the smooth and careful manner of someone who had spent a long time constructing a presentation of herself that she was determined no one would look behind. She was, on the surface, everything her neighborhood expected: polished, charitable, connected, the kind of woman who served on 2 nonprofit boards and attended the correct fundraisers and sent handwritten thank you notes. She was also, beneath that surface, the kind of woman who made her house cleaner take the service entrance. Not always, just when certain guests were there, just when the presentation required it. Yolanda noted this. She did not comment on it. She had been cleaning houses for 3 years and had learned to distinguish between clients who were thoughtless and clients who were deliberate, and Vivienne Marsh was deliberate in ways that accumulated. There were the things left out when Yolanda arrived: documents on the kitchen table, a specific laptop open, an organization that suggested Vivienne expected to be alone when Yolanda was there in a way that spoke to something. There were the phone calls Vivienne sometimes had in the room she hadn't realized Yolanda was in yet, calls that ended quickly and smoothly when she registered the presence. There was the second phone, the one Yolanda first noticed in the charging cradle in the guest bathroom, a room Vivienne clearly didn't expect Yolanda to reach on the days she arrived early. Yolanda cleaned and observed and kept her own counsel. She needed the work. She understood the difference between knowing something and acting on what you know. And she was, in the careful way of women who have been navigating asymmetric power for their entire adult lives, waiting to understand the shape of a thing before deciding what to do with it. Calvin came with her on Saturdays. He sat in the kitchen with his book and his juice box and watched the house the way his mother had taught him to watch things, not intrusively, not with obvious attention, just with the steady peripheral awareness of a child who has learned that noticing is a skill worth cultivating. He watched Vivienne move through the rooms. He watched the way she was on the phone versus the way she was in person. He watched the second phone and who she was when she was on it. Looser, different. The performance dropped in a way that suggested the person on the other end was one of the few people to whom she did not perform. He was 7 the first Saturday she brought Thomas Beaumont to the house. Thomas Beaumont had built Beaumont Properties from a two-man real estate consulting operation into a regional firm managing commercial and residential assets across coastal Georgia and South Carolina. A 15-year arc of disciplined work that had produced a company of 32 employees, a reputation for integrity that was the actual foundation of everything he'd built, and a personal net worth that put him in the category of people Vivienne Marsh had identified 3 years ago as worth knowing well. He was not a naive man. He had been through one divorce early in his career and had spent 12 years afterward building a life that was full and purposeful without requiring a partner. Until 14 months before the wedding, he had met Vivienne at a charity auction and found in her exactly the qualities he had been waiting, without quite knowing it, to find. She was intelligent. She was attentive. She seemed to see him with the specific, flattering clarity of someone who valued what he had built because they understood what it took to build it. He was not wrong that she was intelligent. He was wrong about almost everything else. What Thomas did not know, what Thomas had no mechanism to discover without help, was that Vivienne Marsh had been engaged once before to a man named Gregory Hollins in Charleston, a property developer with a similar profile to Thomas, and that the engagement had ended 16 months before Vivienne met Thomas, under circumstances that Gregory Hollins had spent considerable emotional energy trying to understand, and had arrived eventually at a version of the truth that he had not known how to prove. What Thomas also did not know was that Vivienne's financial situation, the Colonial in Ardsley Park, the car, the nonprofit boards, was constructed on the surface tension of credit and performance and the inheritance of a grandmother whose money had been, by Vivienne's careful accounting, almost gone for 2 years. And what Thomas absolutely did not know, because this was the piece that Vivienne had managed most carefully, was that the man she spoke to on the second phone 3 to 4 times a week was a man named David, who lived in Atlanta and who had been told something about his relationship with Vivienne that was, to put it in the most direct language, not consistent with the life she was performing in Savannah. Calvin knew about David. He had been in the kitchen on a Saturday 8 months before the wedding when Vivienne, believing Yolanda was in the laundry room and Calvin was absorbed in his book, had taken a call on the second phone, had walked to the living room doorway, not far enough, and had spoken in the loose, dropped performance voice that Calvin had cataloged over 2 years of Saturdays. He had not been trying to listen. He had simply been, as he always was, paying attention. He understood what he had heard. He was 7 years old, and he understood it with the particular clarity of a child who has been told to watch what people do when they think nobody's looking, and who has been doing exactly that, and for whom this was not the first piece of the picture, but the piece that completed it. He told Yolanda that night, in their apartment, in the careful language of a child trying to render something accurately. Yolanda was quiet for a long time. She asked him to tell her again. He did. She asked 2 questions. He answered them. Then she sat with it the way she sat with everything that required weight, without rushing, without the performance of a decision already made, actually thinking. She thought about her work, about the 6 houses and the rent and Calvin's school supplies. She thought about Thomas Beaumont, whom she had never met but whose photograph she had seen on Vivienne's refrigerator, a man with a face that suggested he was not a bad person. She thought about the kind of woman Vivienne Marsh was, and what she would do if Yolanda brought this to her directly. She thought about what her son had been taught and what it meant to teach it and then not act on it yourself. She thought for 2 weeks. She went back to clean Vivienne's house 3 more times during those 2 weeks. On the 3rd visit, she found the wedding invitation on the kitchen table. The date was in 6 weeks. She picked up her mop and went back to work, and she made her decision on the drive home. She did not go to Vivienne. She knew exactly what that conversation would produce. She did not call Thomas Beaumont's office. because she had no standing in that conversation that would survive the first 60 seconds. She thought about going to the church. She thought about a letter. She thought about every approach and assessed each one against the same question. What will actually reach him before it's too late? It was Calvin who said simply, sitting at the kitchen table doing his homework, "Mama, I could just tell him." Yolanda looked at her son. "At the wedding," he said, "when they ask if anybody knows a reason, that's what that part is for, right?" She stared at him. "You taught me to say true things," he said, "even when it's hard." Yolanda sat down. She looked at Calvin for a long time. At this boy, 8 years old, with his homework in front of him and his juice box and his complete and uncomplicated understanding of moral obligation, and felt something in her chest that she didn't have words for. The particular feeling of a parent who has tried to raise a child correctly and is confronted unexpectedly with evidence that it worked. "You know what that would cost," she said. "I know," he said. "We'd probably lose the job. Probably more than that." He nodded. He had thought about it, but he's going to get hurt worse if nobody says anything. That's not right either. Yolanda looked at her son for another long moment. Then she ironed his best shirt. The church was full, and the flowers were white, and the light came through the stained glass in the particular way that makes people feel that something important is happening, which it was, though not in the way that 212 guests expected. Calvin sat with Yolanda in the last pew. They had no invitation, had arrived early, had sat without being asked to leave because the ushers had not thought to ask. He sat very still. He watched the front of the room. He watched Vivian Marsh in her dress, and watched the way she moved through the ceremony with the complete and polished performance of a woman who had done this before. He waited for the question. When it came, if any person can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined in marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Calvin Reese stood up. The room noticed him the way rooms notice unexpected things. All at once, in a wave, the attention snapping to the back pew, and the small boy standing in the too big shirt with the polished shoes. "Sir," he said, "your fiancée is lying." The silence was complete. Thomas Beaumont looked at him across 212 people in the silence, and what came across his face was not dismissal, and not rage, and not the expression of a man who was going to have the boy removed. It was the expression of a man who has just felt very clearly the thing he has been not feeling for 14 months, the specific weight of something that didn't add up, that he has been choosing carefully not to add. "Come here," Thomas said. His voice was even, quiet, the voice of a man who has decided to find out what he's been not finding out. Calvin walked down the aisle. Vivian's face had done something complicated and irreversible. The bouquet trembled again and was still. Calvin stood in front of Thomas Beaumont and told him what he had heard 8 months ago in the living room doorway. In the same careful, accurate language he had used to tell his mother, he said David's name. He said what had been said. He said it the way an 8-year-old says things when he has been raised to say them plainly, without editorializing, without performance, as fact, delivered because the alternative was to hold it, and he had been taught that holding something like this was its own kind of lie. The room was absolutely still. Thomas looked at Calvin for a long moment. Then he looked at Vivian. Vivian opened her mouth. She closed it again. It was the closing of the mouth that told the room everything. Thomas Beaumont did not marry Vivian Marsh. The officiant closed his book. The guests left in the particular quiet of people who have witnessed something that will stay with them and are not yet ready to speak about it. Vivian left through a side door with 2 of her bridesmaids and did not speak publicly about what had happened, which was the only graceful thing available to her, and which she took. Thomas sat in the front pew of St. Matthias Episcopal Church for 20 minutes after the room emptied, alone except for his brother who sat beside him without speaking because there was nothing to say that was more useful than being there. He was not destroyed, this was the word his brother would use later, recalibrated. The kind of painful, necessary recalibration that comes from discovering that the foundation you were building on was not what you believed, and that you had been given this information before the structure went up rather than after. He asked one of the ushers who the boy was. The usher didn't know. Thomas found Yolanda Washington in the parking lot, standing beside her 2011 Civic with Calvin, who was holding the jacket he'd had to take off because it was hot outside, and August in Savannah is not interested in the formality of occasion. He had the expression of a child who has done something he knew was right and is now waiting with the patience of someone who has learned that the consequences of right actions are not always immediate or legible. To find out what comes next, Thomas crouched down to Calvin's level. He looked at the boy for a moment, at the too big shirt, now untucked, at the polished shoes, at the face that was waiting without fear for whatever was coming. That took courage, Thomas said. Calvin looked at him steadily. My mama says doing the right thing isn't always easy. He held the boy's gaze another moment, the particular recognition of a man looking at something he didn't expect to encounter and knowing it for what it is. Then he stood. He looked at Yolanda. She was watching him with the assessment of a woman who has spent her entire adult life reading people in their unguarded moments, and who was reading him now, precisely and without hurry. You're going to lose your position with her, Thomas said. I know, Yolanda said. I'd like to help with that. If you'll let me, my office building needs a full-service cleaning contract, 12,000 square feet, 5 days a week. He paused. It needs to be done right. I don't want to have to think about it. I've always done it right. I know, Thomas said. That's why I'm asking. The contract started the following Monday. It was 3 times the income of all 6 houses combined. 3 years later, Calvin Reese turned 11 in a classroom where he was a grade ahead of his age group, in a school that Yolanda had been able to access because the new income had unlocked a different zip code, taught by a teacher who had written on his last report card. Calvin approaches every problem with remarkable precision and moral clarity. I have not had a student like him. Yolanda read the report card at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. Outside, the neighborhood was quieter than the one they'd come from. The streetlights worked. She thought about St. Matthias Episcopal Church, about the too big shirt she had ironed on a Saturday afternoon, and the boy who had put it on and walked down that aisle and stood in front of a man he didn't know and said the true thing. She thought about Calvin at the kitchen table saying, "You taught me to say true things, even when it's hard." She hadn't known when she taught it exactly what she was building. Parents rarely do. You lay the materials down in the years when the child is small and the application is still abstract, and you trust that what you plan in that territory between instruction and example will become, eventually, something that can bear weight. Calvin came into the kitchen. He looked at the report card. He shrugged in the way 11-year-olds shrug at things they've put genuine effort into and don't know how to receive praise about yet. Mrs. Patterson says you're the best student she's had, Yolanda said. He shrugged again, opened the refrigerator. Calvin. He looked at her. I'm proud of you, she said. Not for the report card, for all of it. For the church and the aisle and the too big shirt and the knowledge at 8 years old that doing the right thing and doing the easy thing were not always the same, and the choice between them was never actually a choice. He looked at her for a moment. Then, I know, Mama. He got his juice box, sat at the table, opened his homework, and Yolanda watched her son. This boy she had raised in 2-job apartments on the reading of books and the watching of people and the instruction that true things should be said even when they were hard, and felt, with a completeness she could not have manufactured, that she had done the most important work of her life, not in someone else's house, in hers.